Welcome in, Hokies fans, to this week's edition of the Tech Sideline Podcast. We're right around the corner from spring game weekend in Blacksburg. We'll get you all set for everything that you need to know for the weekend and heading into the spring game on Saturday afternoon. And it's an all-football show today right here on the Tech Sideline Podcast. We hope you enjoy. That's all coming up on episode 293 of the TSL Podcast, and it starts right now. We record on Wednesday, April 12th, 2023 from our high-tech studio at the Virginia Tech Corporate Research Center right here in Blacksburg, Virginia. We welcome you in whether you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you consume your podcasts, or if you're watching on YouTube. If you are on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe while you're over there, and also turn on that notification bell so you don't miss any future TSL content. Tech Sideline is presented by First Bank and Trust Company. First Bank and Trust Company is the bank that puts you first. Visit www.firstbank.com to learn more. All right, let's get our introductions in order today. Again, an all-football show, so we got our all-football crew in attendance. To my right, lead analyst and columnist Chris Coleman. Across the way, senior staff writer Andy Bitter. In the fourth chair today, managing editor David Cunningham. And behind the scenes, producing this afternoon, founder and general manager Will Stewart. I'm your host, Giovanni Heater, and again, we thank you for joining in. Let's jump right into the football conversation here. First and foremost, admission is free to the spring game this year. Virginia Tech is encouraging fans to support via NIL donations instead. Kind of your thoughts on this, Ankle? It was news to me that it was always free going into last year. Now they bring it back to free, but I think it is good to spark up that NIL, and I think a lot of people kind of buy into that because they know the importance of it.
I think the fact that they charged for the spring game last year was just because it was coming after having the last couple of years with less revenue because of COVID. But in the end, it's such a limited amount of money that you make from the spring game that they can make a bigger impact by asking people to make that donation to NIL instead.
Yeah, I know a lot of people last year made a big stink about the $5 admission. Michael Neislick, former Roanoke Times employee, he was the leading the charge there. I didn't really think it was a big deal, $5 to get in, but this is probably a better way to do it. If NIL is sort of the future of where revenues need to go in these programs, if you're going to try to get some of these players, it would make sense to try to get people to pump money into that system. So it makes sense. I'm curious how many people actually do it. If I'm just going to a game, I'm like, hey, free admission. I'm not going to worry about paying anything, but I'm sure there are other Virginia Tech fans out there that would think otherwise.
If $100,000 can find a starting offensive lineman somewhere, it would be money well spent, I would say, from an NIL perspective.
There you go. Well, let's sort of set the table here a little bit. I want to ask you guys, Andy's been more on the covering side. Chris, you've, of course, covered these things, but you've also been, as a fan, as a student, where are kind of the best hangout spots, where to park? That's a big question people have coming into the spring game. So, what is your kind of game plan if you're a fan going into Saturday?
Oh, the beauty of it is you can park anywhere. There's no assigned lots. So if you're one of those people where you never have a spot close to the stadium during games, this is your chance. If you roll in there early enough and get a good spot, you can set up and tailgate wherever you want. You just got to be careful, don't leave it too late, because then you're going to be stuck parking downtown or something like that. Because you remember they don't clear the lots for the spring game as much as they do for regular football games and things like that. So you're competing for other events also on campus for parking. So it's kind of uncoordinated, but I generally always park in lot 5 myself because it's the quickest lot to my house after the game. But yeah, I like the spring game because it is easier. It's easier to go tailgate with your friends and things like that because everybody can actually park together. Like, I have to walk almost a mile, probably over a mile, to get to my friend's tailgate during the season. But that's not the case during the spring game. You just roll in there and park right next to them.
As a writer who never partakes in the pregame festivities like that, I'm curious, what is the tailgating scene like at a spring game?
It's excellent.
Is it pretty good?
It's better. From a coordination standpoint, it's better because you have so many tailgating groups during the season, and they'd like to tailgate together, but they can't because they're in different parking lots, and you're trying to walk around, and you want to go to this person's tailgate, you want to go to this person's tailgate, but the spring game, it's like, guys, why don't y'all just park next to each other for the spring game, because you can, and now we can all park in this one spot as opposed to everybody parking on the four corners of campus and hopefully eventually making it to the tailgate that you want to make it to. So it's not a real game at the end of the day, but like the actual tailgating experience is less stressful and in some ways better in terms of coordination.
From a student's perspective, for the second year in a row, out of respect for April 16th, what they're actually going to do, no Center Street again this year. It falls on the day before this year. But last year there was no Center Street. And again, that's out of respect. And, I think it's going to be a little more low key. People are still going to, from a student's perspective, enjoy the spring game and the festivities before. But Center Street won't be a part of it. So if you're a student listening, don't plan on going over to Center Street. There won't be much going on over there. Another jam-packed weekend. They seem to really pack the weekend full of other things to do besides the spring game, because so many people, alumni, come in to enjoy a full weekend. A lot of the time you have to stay the night, so why not do other things? Of course, the Run for Remembrance is going to be on Saturday morning, but baseball plays Georgia Tech all weekend long at English Field, 7 p.m. first pitch on Friday, 7 p.m. on Saturday, so you can leave right from the spring game, go head over to English Field and watch the baseball team play, and then 1 p.m. on Sunday should be a great series with the Yellow Jackets. And then softball's actually on the road this year, but women's lacrosse plays the 19th ranked team in the country. They play Clemson at Thompson Field at noon on Saturday, so you can catch that before the 3 p.m. spring game. Come on out, or you can tune in on the ACC Network Extra if you're out tailgating. Throw it on. A lot of people on their RVs and whatnot have TVs and stuff, so definitely be sure to support the other sports. That lacrosse game is going to be great. Tech's won 3 in a row. They're playing a top 25 team, looking to win what would be their second top 25 game of the season against the top 25 team. So big opportunity there. Thompson should be rocking. So definitely head out to all those events. And let's dive into the format of this game a little bit. Chris and Andy, I know you guys both have a lot to say about your thoughts on how they format this thing.
Price said they're going to split it up and make it as even as possible, right? But he didn't specify exactly how they're going to split it up. Is it going to be like the starting defensive line on one team and then the starting offensive line on the other team? Or is it just going to be half the starting defensive line on one team and half on the other team, and 3 offensive line starters on one team and 2 on another team? We don't know how it's going to be split up, which is kind of like one of the reasons it's kind of hard to take seriously as far as the results of the game. Like, you don't know which quarterback is going to be playing behind which offensive line, and you don't know. I mean, if they split the offensive line up, then both quarterbacks are going to be playing behind at least 2 backup offensive linemen. So it's the format of the game is to try to get it over as quickly as possible without having anybody get hurt. They're going to throw the ball a lot, as you've always said, to avoid injuries, which you're more likely to get hurt in the running game. They're going to do a running clock in the second half, and they're going to stop the game early if it runs over that the time limit for the ACC network. That's extra. So coaches are very, very paranoid these days about giving away information on their teams, and the fact that spring games are now televised or available for viewing on the internet in this case, it's actually has led to a downgrade to a certain extent in the quality of spring games, because coaches they don't want to put as much out there.
Spring games, it's never interesting most
Really
of the
not.
time. I mean, there's not a good way to split up the teams, as you mentioned. I've seen sometimes where they're we'll have the first team offensive tackles and the second team guards. It's well, what does that tell you? These guys never play together, and all of a sudden they're going to be thrown together on the same thing. There's always one team that's clearly better than the other team. I know last year the quarterback split. Jason Brown got the short stick of the offensive unit that he was playing with last year. Typically, if anybody even has a hangnail, they're going to keep them out of this game, especially if they're an important player. The coaches will be like, how about you just sit this one out and not play in this? So as much as all of us want this to be real football, it's just not going to be real football. And as you mentioned, the coaches don't want to really do this. It's a necessity. They have to do it. they realize the fans enjoy it. They realize it's a recruiting event to get players out there and see the stadium atmosphere. But if they had their druthers, it would just be, hey, let's just have a 15th practice out of the spotlight of everybody else. That way we can do situational stuff. And I've seen coaches try to do situational stuff in spring games. It's like, it's just boring. Nobody's following what you're doing here. And you're jumping around from, oh, it's 3rd and 6 to now it's 4th and 15. And it's like, just play a game or something close to a game. And it's tough to simulate because you know, unless you're going all out in football all the time, it's tough to get that game experience. And they don't want them going necessarily all out all the time because they don't want injuries to happen.
Do you remember UVA's football festival? Like, they stopped calling it a spring game, and they just started calling it a festival or a festivus or something
Have
like
various
that.
drills and stuff like that.
Yeah, it wasn't even like a real
game. It has to be some semblance. It has to be some semblance of a game for people to enjoy it.
Correct.
Otherwise, you're just watching, you know, various drills and stuff like that. And that's not as much fun.
And as Chris has alluded to before, like, you don't want them to go full speed, but it's almost, you know, if you're only going half speed, you're almost more apt for injuries too, because guys start to hold up.
I mean, it's going to be a full speed game and everything like that. They're just going to, they're going to play as many guys as they can, limit the number of snaps of their key players, keep their quarterbacks in a yellow jersey, and keep that clock running in the second half.
In a way, the tackling looks a lot more like the Pro Bowl, right? They don't really, once they kind of break into the secondary.
If I'm Chris Marv, it doesn't.
Fair.
I would be very angry if my defense went out there and tackled like they did in the Pro Bowl. The Pro Bowl is a reward. It's a trip, basically. You're still fighting for your spot if you're a player. So if you're a defensive player and if you're Jaden Keller, if you're Jaden McDonald or whatever other Jadens we have on this team, there's a whole bunch of them. You're fighting it out for that Mike linebacker spot. I mean, you don't want to hold up in this game. You want to take advantage of the opportunity that's in there. But as a coach, you want to limit the chances for injuries and split the reps up as much as you can, because like you can tell more about these guys, I think, from regular practices than you can this actual spring game.
One last note on the format. So it's going to be in the second half, a complete running clock. And because they have to squeeze it into a 2-hour window due to the ACC Network extra regulations, they might even cut the game short if it comes to that point.
If your spring game is going over 2 hours, you are doing it wrong.
Yeah, you are.
Like, I don't care. Run the clock from the start. You don't need to have this long, drawn-out spring game. It's like baseball. Keep the clock moving here. Yeah, let's have a pitch clock. Let's cut down the play clock to even shorter, whatever it is. Just keep it moving because you don't need to go that long.
How many quarterbacks do you think we see? We have 7 rostered, 6 on scholarship. Do we see all of them?
We'll see all 7 of them. I don't know if this official rule is still in place, but when Beamer was here, the coaching staff had a rule where every single player on the team had to play in the spring game if they were healthy. And every quarterback got in the game last spring. So I would think you'll see all of them this year, even if like the bottom guys only get in there for like one drive at the end of the game. I expect you'll see, and even if they just hand it off every time, they will be in the game. And you know that's another thing. It's going to be a very, very short game, and you got 7 quarterbacks. So if you expect to see like an hour and a half of Grant Wells versus Kyron Drones fighting it out, you're going to see maybe the first half of a shortened game.
For me, there's almost more value in those young guys getting the
No doubt.
snaps anyway. I'd rather see Pop Watson go out there and play
Sure.
than Grant Wells. Like,
Yeah.
I've seen Grant Wells. The fans have seen Grant Wells. They're excited about somebody like Pop Watson,
Right.
who's never been, you know, how many times has he gone in the stadium even to practice at this point? So, yeah, there'll probably be a second half split where those, you know, second team quarterbacks or lower on the depth chart quarterbacks get in the game. But sometimes that's the more interesting part. I know they're going up against 3rd and 4th string defenses and stuff like that, so it's not this great evaluation tool. But just in terms of the experience part of it, I think that can help those guys.
So what can we truly even learn from a media standpoint, from people that follow the team, from watching the spring game?
I think you can learn some things about physical abilities of certain players. Like last year, I think we learned that Caleb Smith was probably a little more athletic than we thought he was, and that played out during the course of the season. We saw Breon Murray really struggle in coverage, and that also played out during the season. You can tell some things about certain players from the spring game. on the other hand, that there are times when a guy lights it up in the spring game. Like I remember one time there was a walk-on defensive end named Jeremy Haynes who had 3 sacks in the spring game, and everybody was like, "Oh my God, is Jeremy Haynes going to start this year?" And no, he's not. It's just he was against the third string offensive line, and I remember Michael Vick going something like 3 of 12 in the spring game, and I'm like, I don't know if he's quite ready yet. So it's just you got to be careful with what you take out of it.
They design these things certain ways. I remember when I was at Auburn, and it was in 2010. And the quarterback who had the best spring game was Neil Caudle. Went out there, threw for a bunch of yards. Barrett Trotter, another quarterback, lit it up, bunch of yards. Worst statistical line by far of the 3, Cam Newton, who went on to have a pretty good season. And I think they sort of designed the spring game so that he didn't have that great of a day and didn't put up these huge numbers, and the hype would have gotten out of control. At the same time, there are some guys that you see go out there that you can just see sort of stardom bursting. I go back to Caleb Farley in 2017, which was really the only memorable spring game showing that I can remember since I've been covering Virginia Tech. And, he switches from defense to offense midway through the spring, kind of going out there on natural ability at that point. I think they were just like telling him where to line up and what routes to run when he was out there, but he was so athletic and so talented that he was turning Brandon Faison around in the defensive backfield, and we're talking about like an established cornerback who was really good. I think he drew 2 or 3 pass interference calls on him, caught a deep ball on him. Another time, it was just you go, man, this guy's going to get on the field in some way. And I always kind of wish that he would have got on the field offensively, because I think he could have been an interesting player in that regard. But there are some guys like that where it's just like, this is coming at a certain point. I remember when I covered UVA, Chris Long had like 3 sacks, got close enough to breathe on the quarterback, and they whistle it dead at a certain point. That was sort of his coming out party, where it's like, okay, this guy's going to be a factor in the future. And sure enough, he was. So sometimes that's fool's gold, and you can't really, believe it. I will shout out Jeremy Haynes, big fan of the Bitter blog back in the day at the Roanoke Times. So I have a special place in my heart for him there. But yeah, there are other times you're like, this guy's got it, and you can sort of see the seedlings of that at the spring game for the first time.
So what would it take for something, kind of piggybacking off that, what would it take for you to see something on Saturday that would truly impress you?
Be cool if one of those running backs, specifically one of the top 2 running backs, went out there and broke some tackles, had some really good vision, and broke off 2 or 3 big runs or good runs. So you can look forward and say, okay, we know Virginia Tech has to get better in the running game. I mean, they're going to run the ball more this year than they're going to pass it, no question. And for the passing game, I think the way they're trying to set up the passing game in this packaged play RPO type thing is going to be reliant on an effective running game. So if the running backs can go out there and impress me on Saturday, that will make me feel better about the offense in general this season.
I'm most curious to see how these receivers fare against these defensive backs, because I think you look at the roster and you see Dorian Strong, Monsieur Delane, Derek Canteen. You've got 3 pretty good cornerbacks there. And you have this fresh group of wide receivers, the 3 transfers coming in, second-year guys in the program now like Gosnell and Tucker Holloway, and Christian Moss has been here a couple years now. Can these guys take that next step? And if they're out there and they make plays against that caliber of cornerback, I think that's a good sign for this passing game. So those are matchups that I'll be real interested to see, because that's sort of been the knock on these receivers the last couple of years here, is they can't get separation. If you can get separation on the guys that they're going up against, I think that's a pretty good sign.
Good opportunity to take a short stint and remind you that this show is brought to you by First Bank and Trust Company, but the Tech Sideline podcast is also presented by Virginia Green. Virginia Tech is partnering with Virginia Green to help create healthy lawns all across Virginia. Register for a chance to win free lawn care with Virginia Green for the 2023 season. Again, thank you so much to both First Bank and Trust Company and Virginia Green. Also a good time. Check in with David in the 4th chair. See if you have anything, any input here, D. Connor.
Yeah, well, one of the things I was nodding when Andy made his last point about the wide receivers. I think that's kind of the one position I think we haven't gotten as much information about this spring, because Fontel Mines kind of likes to mix and match, and I think those 3 transfers are still trying to work their way in. I'm curious to see how the wide receivers shake out, and I think that'll be the first time we really get like a depth chart-ish look at the receivers, kind of figure out where everybody stands. But like Andy said, I think going up against that caliber of cornerbacks, those are good cornerbacks. Who's going to win those battles? I would expect it to be the corners, but if those wide receivers like Ollie Jennings, Steve, we've heard about Stephen Gosnell and Tucker Holloway improving. If they can make some plays, that'll be really interesting. I'm also curious, and I'm curious to see where some of these guys are with injuries. We've seen Daquan Wright, Dorian Strong. They haven't necessarily been full goes in practice every single week. Kind of curious to see where that goes. And then I'm looking for the young guys, right? We know Mose Phillips and Jalen Jones have been getting a lot of reps at safety. I think that's just one example of young guys kind of getting reps at a position where they could potentially be in the 2 deep. I'm curious to see whether it's at offensive line or at defensive line. If Keyshawn Burgos is repping with the 2 defensive ends. Kind of curious to see how all those young guys shake out, because I think that kind of player development is something that this program has been lacking over the past couple of years.
It's funny you should bring up Ollie Jennings right after you talked about the wide receivers versus the defensive backs. Ollie Jennings is the one wide receiver on this team we know can beat a Virginia Tech defensive back in the air for a football, right?
True.
The end of the ODU game last year.
Right. And we saw it in practice as well. He had a couple of big plays, right, early on.
I don't remember.
And we'll see if he's full go.
Yes, because remember, he's coming off surgery.
Yeah, he hasn't been quite 100%. I think
Yeah.
they're still kind of working him into the mix. So again, when it comes to these guys, and like if they're a little nicked up, I'd be surprised if Daquan Wright played.
Yeah,
Based on Tuesday, he was still sort of limited in the back of the line, not necessarily full go, or at least didn't look like that. He had a pull, I assume a hamstring pull or something like that earlier in the spring. So if you can put those guys that are going to be impact guys in the fall and bubble wrap for the spring game, you probably do so.
If Virginia Tech is playing Wake Forest this weekend, then you're going to play Daquan Wright. But Virginia Tech isn't. It's the spring game, so
right.
Yeah, bubble wrap, like you said.
And I think one of the things that does is it gives other guys, young guys, opportunities. If those tight ends behind Nick Gallo and Daquan Wright, if Daquan Wright cannot go, or they're going to play it safe and put him in bubble wrap, like you said, Chris, that gives opportunities for the guys behind him, right? And so we might get to see a little bit more of how maybe the third string guy does against the ones on the other side, right? Or if it's Dorian Strong, right, who's been a little nicked up. Maybe if Dorian Strong doesn't go, okay, well, we might get a glimpse of those third, fourth, fifth guys at cornerback, how they match up against Tech's best wide receivers, right? So I'm curious to see how. Obviously, there are going to be guys who are not going to play due to injury, but I think getting the young guys reps, kind of like what you said, Andy. Like, I'd be more interested in seeing Pop Watson throw, and seeing some of these young guys get reps, like a Jeremiah Coney, right, a running back who's been raved about all spring. I'm more interested in seeing, well, maybe not with a guy like Bashal Tootin coming in, but a lot of other positions, right? Who some of the incumbents are going to be. I'm curious to see some of the new faces and how they kind of mesh and what they can provide.
How about the recruiting aspect of the spring game? Probably the most important piece of this entire weekend.
I think when you look at all the schools in this region, you have to go all the way up to Happy Valley before you find another football crowd that does it as good or better than Virginia Tech for the spring game. And you probably have to go all the way south to Georgia or Clemson or somewhere like that before you can find a crowd. So for the most part, like with the schools Virginia Tech recruits against head-to-head, if you can get guys to visit for the spring game, it really puts it in their head that Virginia Tech is a bigger football school than UVA and North Carolina and Duke and Wake Forest and Maryland and whoever else Virginia the Hokies recruit against in this region. So that's if you can get a guy to visit for spring game weekend. So I definitely think it's one of those things, like you have your regular campus visits if you're a recruit, where you get to meet the coaches and tour the campus and learn about the lifestyle and everything like that. But it's different when you see the fan base in action and you understand how important football is to the school and the alumni base.
We say that, but one of the best recruiting weekends they had was the 2012 spring game. They got canceled by rain or weather. They didn't even play it, and they got like 6 commitments that day. It was Bucky Hodges and Andrew Matupawaka. Vinny Mahota kicked off the 2014 class by committing that early. They had all these guys, and the one that gets me sort of an afterthought in the whole thing. He was the first one that committed, but didn't get a lot of publicity at the time. Charles Clark. Out of Suffolk, Kings Fork High. And then you look years later, Chuck Clark is the guy who's played for how many ever years in the NFL, still going strong. He's a pretty good safety. I think he's with the Jets now, right? Didn't they trade him?
Yeah,
I think he's coming up on. I think
traded him.
This will be his 7th season in the NFL, I believe.
Yeah, so it's funny that you think, oh, this guy's going to be the star, this guy's going to be the star, and it turns out to be the one that nobody really thought of at the time. But that was a game that wasn't even played, and I'm sure the coaches are like, well, we'll just put all of our efforts into recruiting this weekend, and they were very persuasive that weekend, I guess.
What year was that? Do you guys remember?
That was 2012.
2012. So that was your only second year here, right, Andy?
Yes, that was my first spring game.
Gotcha.
For Virginia Tech.
Very cool.
Your first spring game did not actually happen.
Yeah, I think I have the timing of that right.
That sounds about right. That sounds right.
So any other memorable spring games moments that you can maybe share with some of our listeners that obviously you mentioned some already that kind of stick out to you? Or is it one of those events that it's like, you remember it was fun, but like football wasn't really great and you just hung out before and enjoyed the time?
I remember more spring game tailgates than I do spring games, if I'll put it to you that way. I remember my first spring game was 1999 and Michael Vick and Roniel Whitaker were pretty much best friends and teammates and roommates. And at one point, Vic takes off on a scramble, and Roniel, as Roniel liked to do a lot, hit him late out of bounds. Hit the franchise late out of bounds in a spring game. It's like, what are you doing, man? And then Vic got back up and hit him, and they both got 15-yard personal flag penalties, if I recall correctly. Best friends in a spring game. I remember Brian Randall in 2002. He played quarterback for both teams because he was the only quarterback available healthy, because Grant Knoll had torn his ACL that week in practice. And they didn't even put the yellow jersey on Brian Randall. Like these days, like half the coaches don't even want to have a spring game. Back then it was like, oh, only scholarship quarterback on the team. That's fine. You can play for both teams and just have both teams beat up on you and never get a break and anything like that. So I like thinking back, like how crazy was that? Like if Randall had gotten hurt in that game.
Well, I think that's why most spring games are not memorable.
Yes.
Because if anybody comes within 10 feet of the quarterback these days, like Roniel Whitaker would have been suspended for like a year for hitting the star quarterback, let alone hitting the star quarterback out of bounds.
In practice.
And, if Randall was the only healthy quarterback on the roster, they'd just cancel the game these days. They'd be like, we don't have enough healthy players. We're just going to have a practice. Right. And the fans would be like, okay. Because that's happened before. Mm-hmm. I mean, Pitt, when Paul Chryst was there, looked for every excuse not to play a spring game. So I think just sort of the mentality around these things have changed. And, it's years of a star player getting hurt. I remember Wisconsin one year, Lee Evans got hurt on like the last play of the spring game. And after that, it's like, why would we even put him out there for these things? So I think coaches are so careful about that. They are very paranoid about information getting out, even though I feel like there's a lot more information in the game tape that everybody has than what they would have in a spring ball telecast. And that's just the way it's gone. And because of that, it's been watered down competition and the games just aren't that interesting anymore. But it's fun to get out there. Nice weather always helps too.
Andy, you mentioned the 2017 spring game when Caleb Farley had his big day. Hennon Hooker also had a really good day.
Yeah, late. He had nice
He was
drives.
10 of 11 for 115 yards and a touchdown. And he had if I remember correctly, he like in 2018 he had a pretty good spring game too. Like he'd always shown flashes. So like I think you can get to like the points you guys were making earlier. You can kind of get a feel for like some of these guys who flash. It's like, okay, they might be good, but like you said, Chris, you always gotta temper your expectations, figure out if it's reality or not, because obviously, like, Hendon Hooker went on to have a pretty good career.
Did he? What happened to him after he left Virginia Tech? I lost track of him.
But that
over the
defensive
years.
end you mentioned, who had 3 sacks, did not, right?
No,
but
right.
Caleb Farley went
The
on
immortal Jeremy Haynes. Don't forget his name
Yes,
here. Come on now.
well, we gotta put respect on his name. He did pancake Ezekiel Elliott in
He
the
did,
horseshoe that
yeah.
night, because that was his Twitter profile. His pinned tweet, I think, is the video of him pancaking Ezekiel Elliott.
Well, I remember during the pandemic, I busted out the old NCAA football game, and
what a great
I was
game.
playing as Virginia Tech, and I think Haynes was in the game, and he put like this spin move on it. So I recorded the replay of it, and I tweeted it at Haynes. I'm like, there it is, the spin move. That's how you get him. He's
I
like
remember
just
that
like
now.
that spring game that one year.
Tiny little tangent. There's a thing now where you can go through this whole process. You have to like order the USB drive on eBay, put it in, and like jailbreak your PlayStation. But a company took over, turned that game you're talking about into college football now. All the new stadiums, uniforms, they added new teams like JMU. It's very cool. So
I'd do
give it a
that.
chance.
Give me that information.
I will.
I'll
It's
do
called
that.
College Football Revamped.
I
what
still
they
have my Sega Genesis that I bought in 1994. I paid $100 for it, and it still
Okay.
works.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's this used video game store over in Radford, and a couple years ago I went over there and bought College Football USA 96,
Wow.
which was like the first college football game I ever played. It was the first college football game that ever had like every team on it, because the first EA Sports game was a Bill Walsh College Football. It had like 32 teams, and I remember being mad because it didn't have Virginia Tech on it. And Jeff Holland tells this story. Jeff Holland and a bunch of other Virginia Tech football players back then, they all wrote a letter to EA Sports and signed it and said, "Dear EA Sports, we're Virginia Tech football. We've been to 3 bowl games in a row. We've won this many games in the last few years. We've beaten this team, this team, this team, and this team that's all on your game. We should be in the next game." So the next version of the game, EA Sports put every team on there.
Just to tell you how exciting the spring game is, the discussion has been more lively about the college football in the
About
last
video
3
games.
minutes than the spring game before
The
that.
new one even has like every uniform Tech has ever worn, like in the last probably 5-6 years. Like they have the Hokie Stone uniforms. They got like 20 different helmets. The company that took over and did this is pretty unreal.
They have every uniform Virginia Tech's ever worn. What did that take up? Like a terabyte of information?
Yeah, it's a
That's
lot
a
of
lot
stuff,
of
yeah.
uniforms.
It was pretty cool. It's pretty cool.
One of the other things, I was doing research on some of the Tech's old spring games. In 2018, there were 20 players that did not participate in Tech spring game, which kind of gives you some insight as to like, not everybody's going to participate. And it's probably smarter for a lot of these coaching staffs to keep their players healthy and in bubble wrap, like you guys have said previously. So that's another thing. Like in terms of when you watch the spring game, remember that a lot of it's not going to be a lot of the number one personnel per se, right? If one guy gets gets a little injury, a nick in practice this week, he's probably not going to play in the spring game if there's any chance of him re-injuring himself, right? Was it Malachi Thomas that missed last year's spring game?
Yeah, because he got
had
hurt.
been injured all
Yep.
spring. So there are going to be a lot. Again, I'm curious to see the guys who do play, because I think they're probably going to end up being a handful of the starters that just don't end up playing because there's no point in trying to make the injury even more severe.
If there's one thing I remember about that 2018 team, it did not need more practice. Maybe that wasn't the team that needed 20
Yeah.
players sitting out.
Yeah,
They probably could have used that work going into
They
the fall.
probably could have, and that's a big number because if you remember, rosters are a little bit smaller in the spring because not everybody has reported yet. More players will enroll
I mean,
this summer.
I have the list if you guys want.
Right.
If you want
so,
the list.
So like 20 players missing from a spring roster, that's like 30 players missing from like
So-
Well, that's why
fall
I think
roster.
sometimes we don't know exactly what we're doing format wise because we don't know if you have enough guys
Exactly.
to split into 2 teams or
certainly
however
true.
they do it.
Among those who did not participate in 2018, Adonis Alexander, C.J. Carroll, Divine Diablo, Caleb Farley, Reggie Floyd, Damon Hazleton, Trayvon Hill, Eric Kuma, Vinny Mahota, Mook Reynolds, and Trey Turner.
So basically
pretty
half
big
the starters.
So-
or a quarter of the starters.
So a handful of the starters did not participate, which kind of gives you some insight as to, like, you know, if there's some guys when you look on the field and you don't see them, they're probably injured.
So, like, let's play a little game here. Let's say in the scrimmage this past weekend, Byshaw Tootin ran for 200 yards. Let's just pretend that he did. And if you're Brent Pry, you're like, nobody knows who he is. He's just some transfer from FCS. Why would I throw him out there in a spring game? Number one, he might get hurt. Number two, like,
You're giving away what his capabilities
Yeah.
Running
are.
backs especially.
right,
Because all it takes is one lineman falling the wrong way.
exactly.
And you'd feel like an idiot as a coach if you lose what you would expect to be a key piece to a fluke injury like that. And I think you can control a little bit more with the guys on the outside. I mean, you're still going to get fluke stuff out there, but I'd worry about those linemen because sometimes the most benign plays can lead to somebody getting rolled up on, and all of a sudden they got a high ankle sprain that lingers, and that's just what you want to avoid.
I would, just sum all this conversation up, I would say really focus on having a nice tailgate and don't think too much about the game.
So, last final thought here, prediction time. What do you think the fans are going to be talking about after the spring game? Positive, negative, whatever. What are fans going to be talking about?
They're going to find something to talk about with the quarterbacks. I don't know if it's going to be positive, negative, or neutral. But besides that, they're either going to be talking about something with the pass rush. And Frank Beamer was an old school coach, and old school coaches, they say things that sometimes some of those things are still applicable and some aren't. But one of the things he used to say every year that still applies is you get into a scrimmage or a spring game, and if the offense does well, you're happy, but then you're worried about the defense, and the vice versa. Like, I remember one time going to a spring scrimmage, and the defense got 13 sacks in the whole scrimmage, the entire scrimmage. It was insane. So, and that was an offensive line that featured Dwayne Brown, right? So they're going to be saying on Sunday either, oh my gosh, where is Virginia Tech going to get pressure from this year? Like, they didn't put any pressure on the quarterback at all, or maybe, like, if the backup offensive line has a really bad day and at some point, if they're matched up against starting defensive ends, maybe you're saying the opposite. So I think they're going to be talking about the quarterbacks, and then they're going to be talking about the pass rush.
It's always the quarterbacks. I mean, especially this year when it feels like there is a legitimate question about who the quarterback will be come fall. And, I've maintained that I think it's sort of 50-50 right now who starts. I have no idea. And I'm actually writing a mailbag question about this tomorrow that, every year since I've been here, you've sort of had an idea, even if it was ostensibly a competition that was going on, who was going to come out on top, or you had a pretty good idea. And typically that guy did win it. I mean, except for that, weird COVID year where they didn't even have an off season. And then all of a sudden Burmeister's starting and Hendon's coming in. But people will look at how Wells does and how Drones does, and they will dissect every single facet of that competition. And also they like to talk about spring game attendance, which I hate. I guarantee you somebody's going to ask me on Twitter what I think the spring game attendance is. I'm going to reluctantly give an estimate, and that will offend a bunch of people out there who think I've lowballed. It's easily 60,000. I'm like, one half of the stands is not even full. It's not 60,000. I guarantee you that. So I hate coming up with spring game estimates for attendances, because whatever I say, it's wrong, and somebody's going to take offense at it.
Well, it sounds like everyone's going to drudge through the weekend. Anything else from you, David?
No, good. I will mention one non-football thing. J.D. Byers, Virginia Tech officially announced him as new basketball assistant coach. That news came out yesterday, which is Tuesday. Chris, any immediate thoughts on Byers? As I wrote, he's an offensive-minded guy, but he was with Mike Rowe. I mean, he has 13 years of experience at the D1 level, was at Radford for a few years, was on Mike Rowe's staff at Rice for a while, then at VCU. He's been around some really good players, some really good defenses, and he's a good recruiter.
Yeah. I think if I was building a staff at Virginia Tech from scratch, he would be a strong candidate to be on my staff. I don't think he necessarily. I think it's very important for Virginia Tech's staff to, like, certain members, like all coaches have strengths and weaknesses. It's just about putting the right strengths together. I don't know if his strengths as a coach overlap like Mike Young's weaknesses. You know what I'm saying?
Like Chester Frazier's.
Correct, absolutely. And so, yes, he's been a good recruiter for VCU, but it's a lot different recruiting to Virginia Tech, because when you're at VCU, their recruiting competition, VCU has more resources, better facilities, their academic requirements for their athletes. Like, I know they were taking non-qualifiers for a while. It's a lot easier to recruit to VCU against their level of competition than it is to recruit for Virginia Tech against Tech's level of competition. So yeah, like I said, I think if you're building a staff from scratch, he's absolutely on my list. But like, for this particular spot, considering what Tech already has on the staff, like, he's always been an offensive coach. Like, Mike Young, this is Mike Young's offense, and Kevin Giltner, who I assume will be the associate head coach now, or at least the number one assistant, he came from Mike Young's system at Wofford. He's also an offensive coach, even though he was, coaching defense and during games last year. But, like, Tech has offense covered. Tech has plenty of offense. But let's say, like, they need a more defensive focus in their program, in my opinion. So time will tell. And I know he came from a coach where they run a Havoc system, but, like, Virginia Tech's not going to be running the Havoc. Like, VCU out-talents everybody at their level of basketball, and that's not something Tech is going to do. So I don't know. We'll see. Like I said, he's a good basketball coach. My concern is, like, he's not the fit that Virginia Tech needs for that spot on the staff at this moment in time.
Yeah, and you wrote something when I think it was your Friday Q&A last week, about how, from what you had heard, Virginia Tech kind of pursued Chester Frazier again, who was an associate head coach here a couple years ago. Great defensive mind. He's currently at his alma mater of Illinois. It didn't pan out, and I agree with you. I think Byers could be a good fit. I think he's a great coach, assistant coach, but I don't know if he necessarily fills the weaknesses Virginia Tech has, right? This is a very strong offensive team. Virginia, that's what Mike Young brings to the table, and that's what Kevin Giltner is going to bring to the table. Tech's been better on the recruiting trail, I think. I think Giltner and Webster and Mike Jones did a good job. And I think he will probably continue to do a good job, but I think the hole is on the defensive end. And he's been around a lot of good defenses, but like you said, a lot of that is more Havoc style. So I'm curious to see how it pans out. I think he's going to be a good fit. His wife, Marcy, is the head volleyball coach at Virginia Tech, so they get to put all their family in one place. But yeah, I'm very curious to see how it pans out, and I don't think this is a spot he's going to, like Mike Jones, get up and leave,
right?
Which is good for Virginia Tech, but it's also like I don't know if you couldn't have found a better fit in terms of scheme and what you're trying to do in terms of elevating your play on the court, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, that'll do it for episode 293 of the Tech Sideline Podcast, presented by First Bank and Trust Company and Virginia Green. Thanks so much for watching and listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube, and we'll see you next time on the Tech Sideline Podcast.